The champagne glass slipped from my fingers. I watched it fall in slow motion, the crystal shattering against the marble floor of the gallery, sending droplets of golden liquid across my black dress. But that wasn't what made my heart stop. It was the sound of his voice. His voice, saying those words that would replay in my mind for months to come. "Oh, this is Rachel. She's sweet, but she wouldn't understand art like you do, Sophia. Remember how we used to spend hours at the Met?" I stood there, frozen, as my boyfriend of 2 years introduced me to his ex-girlfriend like I was some kind of decorative accessory. Sweet. Sweet. The word tasted bitter in my mouth as I forced a smile, my cheeks burning with embarrassment. Sophia, tall, elegant, with that effortless sophistication that comes from old money and private schools, extended her perfectly manicured hand. "Oh, how nice to meet you." Her tone was polite, but her eyes told a different story. They swept over me with the kind of assessment that made me suddenly aware of every imperfection. My slightly too bright lipstick, my department store dress, the way I was standing just a little too close to the abstract painting behind me. "David always did have a type," she continued, her smile sharp as a blade. "Though I see his standards have evolved." I felt something crack inside my chest. Not break, not yet, but crack, like ice under pressure. David laughed. Actually laughed, as if this woman hadn't just insulted me to my face at his colleague's gallery opening, surrounded by his entire social circle. "Sophia's an art curator at the Whitney now," he said, his voice carrying that tone of admiration he'd never used when talking about my work as a graphic designer. "She's always been brilliant with contemporary pieces." I wanted to disappear, to melt into the floor along with the spilled champagne. Around us, conversations continued, but I could feel eyes on us, some curious, some pitying. Mrs. Harrison from David's law firm whispered something to her husband. The young intern from his office looked like she wanted to rescue me but didn't know how. "I should clean this up," I mumbled, gesturing to the broken glass, grateful for an excuse to escape. "Leave it," David said curtly. "The staff will handle it." But I was already walking away, my heels clicking against the marble with what I hoped sounded like confidence rather than retreat. In the bathroom, I locked the door and stared at myself in the mirror. My reflection looked back at me, flushed, humiliated, diminished. Sweet. The word echoed in my mind. Sweet little Rachel, who wouldn't understand art. Sweet little Rachel, who wasn't sophisticated enough. Sweet little Rachel, who should be grateful that someone like David even noticed her. I splashed cold water on my wrists, trying to calm the fury building in my chest. This wasn't the first time David had made me feel small, but it was the first time he'd done it so publicly, so deliberately. The realization hit me like a physical blow. He'd brought me here to show me off to Sophia, not as his girlfriend, but as proof that he was moving on. I was a prop in his performance of recovery. When I returned to the gallery, they were still talking. Sophia's hand rested on his arm as she leaned in to whisper something that made him throw his head back in laughter. The sound cut through me like broken glass. "There you are," David said when he noticed me approaching. "Sophia was just telling me about the exhibition she's curating next month. Fascinating stuff about postmodern identity." I nodded, not trusting my voice. Sophia's smile was victorious now, like a cat who'd cornered a mouse. "Well," she said, checking her designer watch, "I should go. It was educational meeting you, Rachel." She kissed David's cheek, her lips lingering just a moment too long. "We should catch up properly soon. Maybe over coffee at that little place we used to love?" "I'd like that," David replied, and I felt the final crack in my chest split wide open. After she left, David turned to me with irritation creeping into his voice. "You were so quiet. Sophia probably thinks you're boring." There it was. The final insult wrapped in concern. Not an apology for how he'd introduced me, not acknowledgement of Sophia's obvious disdain, but criticism of my reaction to being humiliated. "I'm tired," I said quietly. "Can we go home?" He sighed, like my exhaustion was an inconvenience. "Fine. But we're stopping by the Hendersons' party first. Just for an hour." As we walked to the car, I caught my reflection in the gallery window. The woman staring back at me looked defeated, smaller somehow. But behind her eyes, something else was stirring. Something that wouldn't be satisfied with going home and pretending this never happened. Something that was done being sweet. The next morning, David acted like nothing had happened. He sat at our kitchen table, scrolling through his phone while drinking the coffee I'd made him, humming that infuriating tune he always hummed when he was pleased with himself. Occasionally, he'd chuckle at something on his screen, and I wondered if he was texting Sophia. "I think last night went really well," he said without looking up. Sophia seemed impressed by the turnout. Sophia. Her name sat in our apartment like an uninvited guest. I poured myself coffee with hands that were steadier than they should have been. "Impressed by what exactly?" I asked, my voice carefully neutral. "The networking? The connections? You know how these things work." He finally looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes I'd been too naive to recognize before. Calculation. "She mentioned she might have some freelance opportunities coming up. Could be good for your little design projects." Little design projects. I'd been running my own successful graphic design business for 3 years, but somehow it had become diminished to little projects in his vocabulary. When had that happened? When had I started letting it happen? "How generous of her," I said, and something in my tone must have registered because he looked at me sharply. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing. It's just interesting how concerned she is about my career." David's jaw tightened. "Sophia's trying to be nice. She doesn't have to help you." "Help me?" As if I were some charity case he'd brought home. I sat down across from him, studying his face. When had he started looking at me like this? Like I was a problem to be managed rather than a partner to be loved. "Tell me about Sophia," I said quietly. "What about her? How long were you together?" He shifted uncomfortably. "You know this. 2 years. We broke up about 6 months before I met you." But I was remembering things now. Little inconsistencies that hadn't mattered before. The way he'd gotten a text during our 3rd date and gone quiet for an hour. The time he'd canceled our weekend plans because of a work emergency that I later found out was an art gallery opening. The photos on his social media that had been quietly deleted. "She's beautiful," I said, watching his reaction. "I guess." But his eyes lit up, just for a moment. "She's always been extraordinary. Intimidating, really. Sometimes I think she was too good for me. Too good for him. But somehow, I wasn't." Over the next few days, I started paying attention. Really paying attention. To the way he talked about me to his friends. Always with that slightly patronizing tone, as if he were describing a pet he was fond of. To how he introduced me. "This is Rachel, my girlfriend." Never, "This is Rachel, she's an incredible designer." Or, "This is Rachel, she just landed that huge client." I was furniture in his life. Comfortable, familiar, useful furniture. But Sophia? Sophia was art. It all came flooding back. The subtle ways he'd been preparing for this moment. The gradual erosion of my confidence through 1,000 small cuts. The way he'd trained me to be grateful for his attention, to shrink myself to make him feel bigger. "You're overthinking again," he said when he caught me staring into space over dinner. "You always do this. You always do this." Another favorite phrase of his, designed to make me question my own perceptions. But I wasn't overthinking. I was finally thinking clearly. I excused myself to the bathroom and opened my laptop. A quick search revealed Sophia's Instagram. Public, of course, because people like her had nothing to hide. The photos told a story. Expensive restaurants, art galleries, vacation homes in the Hamptons. And there, buried in the comments from 3 weeks ago, was a familiar username. David had been liking her photos. Not just recent ones, but going back months. Late-night likes. The kind you leave when you're scrolling through someone's entire history, missing them. I scrolled back further, to posts from 2 years ago. There they were together. David and Sophia at museum openings, charity galas, weekend trips to Martha's Vineyard. He looked different in those photos. More confident, more polished. Like he belonged in that world. And then I found it. A post from 8 months ago, 2 months after we'd started dating. Sophia at some gallery opening, looking radiant in a red dress. David's comment, stunning as always. Some things never change. Some things never change. I sat on the bathroom floor, laptop balanced on my knees, and felt the last pieces of my denial crumble. I hadn't been his girlfriend. I'd been his consolation prize, his placeholder until he figured out how to win back the woman he actually wanted. When I emerged, David was washing dishes, still humming that satisfied tune. "Everything okay?" he asked without turning around. "Perfect," I said, and for the first time in days, I meant it. Because I was done being sweet little Rachel who wouldn't understand art. I was done being the grateful girlfriend who should be thankful for whatever scraps of affection he threw my way. I was done being underestimated. The revelation should have broken me. Instead, it sharpened me. I spent the weekend in a strange state of clarity, watching David with new eyes. He was nervous, I realized, checking his phone constantly, texting someone with a secretive smile. On Sunday evening, he announced he was meeting some colleagues for drinks. "Which colleagues?" I asked innocently. "Just work people. You wouldn't know them." But I did know them. I'd met most of his work friends over the past 2 years, and none of them would warrant the cologne he was putting on, or the way he'd changed his shirt 3 times. After he left, I did something I'd never done before. I searched. Not through his phone. I wasn't that person. But through the apartment we shared, through the life we'd built together, looking for evidence of the man I'd apparently never really known. In his home office, tucked behind his law books, I found a shoebox. Inside were mementos from his relationship with Sophia, ticket stubs from Broadway shows, photos from their European vacation, hotel keycards from romantic weekends. But it was the letter that stopped me cold. "My darling David, I know I said I needed space, but I can't stop thinking about us. This break we're taking feels wrong. I see couples everywhere and think about how good we were together. Maybe I was hasty." The letter was dated 3 months ago. 3 months into our relationship, she'd been writing to him about getting back together. And he'd kept it, hidden it like a treasure. I sat in his chair, holding the letter, and felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Rage. Not sadness, not hurt. Pure, cleansing anger. For the first time since that night at the gallery, I wasn't thinking about what I'd done wrong. I was thinking about what he'd done wrong. And then I started thinking about what I was going to do about it. The next morning, I called my best friend Maya and told her everything. She was quiet for a long moment after I finished. "You know what you have to do, right?" she said finally. "Leave him?" "Well, yes. But first, Rachel, do you remember what you do for a living?" I blinked. "I'm a graphic designer." "You're a brilliant graphic designer who specializes in social media campaigns and digital marketing. You've helped dozens of clients build their brands, launch products, create viral content. You know exactly how to craft a message that reaches the right audience at the right time." She was right. I'd been so focused on being the perfect girlfriend that I'd forgotten who I was professionally. But I knew social media inside and out. I knew how to create content that people couldn't ignore, how to tell a story that would spread like wildfire. "Maya," I said slowly, "I think I need to do some research." "What kind of research?" "The kind that involves David's social media accounts, his friends, his colleagues, and that gallery where he decided to humiliate me." That evening, David came home late again, smelling like expensive perfume that definitely wasn't mine. He was practically glowing. "Good day?" I asked sweetly. "Yeah, great day. Just productive." "Productive?" I almost laughed. "That's wonderful, honey. You seem so happy lately." He looked at me sharply, but I kept my expression innocent. "I'm just glad you're getting what you want." Over the next few days, I became a detective in my own life. I researched everyone who'd been at that gallery opening, mapping out their social connections, their professional networks. I learned that Sophia's gallery was hosting a major exhibition opening next month, the kind of event that would draw hundreds of people from David's world. I also learned some very interesting things about David himself, like the fact that he'd been lying about his college achievements on his law firm's website. He'd claimed to be on the debate team and law review, but a quick check of the university archives showed no record of either. or that his pro bono work with underprivileged kids was actually just one afternoon volunteering at a charity event, photographed, of course, for his social media. But the most interesting discovery was his fear of heights. David had a severe phobia of elevators and tall buildings, something he'd managed to hide from his professional circle through careful planning and excuses. I only knew because I'd been there during his panic attacks, holding his hand in stairwells, making excuses for why we couldn't go to rooftop restaurants. It was a vulnerability he'd trusted me with, and now I was going to use it, but not cruelly. I wasn't interested in destroying him. I was interested in showing him, and everyone else, exactly who he really was behind the carefully constructed image. The plan formed slowly, like a photograph developing in a dark room. It would require perfect timing, flawless execution, and the kind of social media savvy that I'd been building my career on. I started small. Anonymous tips to fact-checkers about his embellished resume. A carefully crafted email to his law firm's HR department about his pro bono claims. Nothing that would ruin his career, but enough to make him sweat. And then I began planning for the main event. Sophia's gallery opening was in 3 weeks. David would be there, of course, probably with Sophia on his arm. All of his colleagues, all of his social circle, all of the people who'd witnessed my humiliation would be there too. It was going to be perfect. The night of Sophia's gallery opening, I looked stunning. I'd spent weeks preparing, not just the plan, but myself. New dress, professional makeup, hair styled to perfection. I looked like someone who belonged in that world, someone who understood art and sophistication and all the things David had implied I lacked. I arrived alone, fashionably late, just as the crowd was reaching its peak. Through the glass windows, I could see David near the center of the gallery, Sophia's hand possessively on his arm. He looked confident, relaxed, like he'd finally found his place in the world. He had no idea what was about to happen. I'd spent the last 3 weeks creating what I like to call David's greatest hits, a carefully curated collection of his most embarrassing moments, all professionally designed with my graphic design skills. Screenshots of his embellished LinkedIn profile next to university records, photos of his one-time charity work with timestamps showing he'd left after 30 minutes, text messages he'd sent to friends complaining about having to attend boring cultural events while publicly posting about his love for the arts. But the centerpiece was something special, a professionally edited video compilation of David's elevator phobia set to classical music. I'd filmed it secretly over the past 2 years, thinking it was sweet how he trusted me with his vulnerability. Now, it would serve a different purpose. I'd created a QR code linking to a private website I'd built. Clean, professional, titled, The Real David Patterson, A Study in Authentic Living. Everything was factual, everything was documented, and everything was absolutely devastating. The beauty of it was the delivery method. I'd hired a small team of art students, actually Maya's cousins, to pose as gallery assistants. They'd been circulating through the crowd all evening, handing out elegant cards with QR codes, telling people it was an interactive digital art piece that complemented the exhibition. By the time I walked through the doors, half the gallery had already scanned the code. I could tell immediately that something was wrong. Clusters of people were looking at their phones, then at David, then whispering to each other. The energy in the room had shifted from sophisticated mingling to something more electric, more dangerous. David spotted me across the room and froze. For a moment, I thought he might actually run. But Sophia was right there, and his colleagues were watching, so he composed himself and walked over. "Rachel," he said, his voice tight. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Oh, I wouldn't miss it," I replied sweetly. "I've been looking forward to this evening for weeks." Sophia appeared at his side, her smile sharp. "How unexpected. David mentioned you weren't interested in art." "I'm learning to appreciate it more," I said, glancing around the room. "There's something beautiful about truth in art, don't you think? The way it reveals things that were always there but hidden." David's face had gone pale. "Rachel, what are you—" "Oh, David," interrupted a voice behind us. It was Mrs. Harrison from his law firm, her phone in her hand, her expression one of barely contained glee. I had no idea you were so creative with your resume. The color drained from his face completely. I don't know what you're talking about. The QR code, dear. The digital art piece. Fascinating work, really. Very revealing. Around us, more people were pulling out their phones, scanning codes, watching videos. I could see the exact moment when each person reached the elevator footage, their expressions shifting from curiosity to shocked amusement. Is this some kind of joke? Sophia asked, but her voice was uncertain now. Actually, I said, pulling out my own phone, it's a social experiment. I'm documenting how people react when they discover the difference between someone's public persona and their private reality. I showed them the real-time analytics from my website. We're at about 250 views so far, with a sharing rate of 73%. Quite impressive for a niche art piece. David grabbed my arm. You need to take this down. Now. Why? I asked innocently. It's all true. You told me yourself that truth is the foundation of any good relationship. The crowd was starting to notice the commotion. Phones were being pulled out, not just to view my content, but to record what was happening. David's humiliation was becoming a live performance. This is insane, Sophia hissed. You're embarrassing yourself. Am I? I looked around the room at the faces watching us. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like I'm finally being seen. Really seen. For the first time in months. I turned back to David, who was now visibly shaking. You know what's funny? You spent so much time convincing me I wasn't smart enough, wasn't sophisticated enough, wasn't good enough for your world. But it turns out I'm exactly smart enough to show your world who you really are. Rachel, please, he whispered. We can talk about this at home. Home? I laughed, and it was a sound I'd never heard from myself before. Confident, powerful, free. David, we don't have a home. We had a carefully constructed lie that I was too sweet to see through. I looked at Sophia, who was staring at David with dawning horror. By the way, Sophia, you should probably know that those late-night texts you've been sending him? He's been showing them to me. Said it was proof of how desperate you were to get him back. The slap came so fast I almost didn't see it. Sophia's hand connected with David's cheek with a sound that cut through the gallery's murmur like a gunshot. You pathetic little man, she snarled. Don't ever contact me again. As she stormed away, David turned to me with something like desperation in his eyes. You've ruined everything. No, I said quietly. I've just stopped pretending to be someone I'm not. You should try it sometime. 3 months later, I was sitting in my new apartment, reviewing the contract for my biggest client yet. The gallery incident had gone viral, of course. Not in the way I'd expected, but in a way that somehow worked out perfectly. The video of David's meltdown had been shared thousands of times, but the real story that caught fire was about the woman who'd used her professional skills to expose a manipulative partner. I'd received interview requests from podcasts, job offers from marketing firms, and messages from hundreds of women who'd recognized their own stories in mine. My graphic design business had tripled in size, and I'd been approached about writing a book about digital empowerment. David, meanwhile, had been quietly asked to leave his law firm, not because of the resume embellishments, those were minor infractions, but because his behavior had become a liability. Clients didn't want to work with someone who couldn't be trusted with basic honesty. I'd heard through Maya that he'd moved back in with his parents and was seeing a therapist. I hoped that was true. Despite everything, I didn't want him destroyed. I'd wanted him to understand what it felt like to be dismissed, to be underestimated, to be seen as less than he was. Sophia had sent me a message a few weeks after the incident. A simple text. Thank you for saving me from making a terrible mistake. Also, your website design was brilliant. We'd met for coffee the following week, and I'd discovered that she wasn't the cold, calculating woman I'd imagined. She was smart, funny, and just as manipulated by David as I had been. We weren't going to be best friends, but we'd found a mutual respect. He told me you were jealous and possessive, she'd said over lattes. Said you were trying to control him by making him choose between his past and his future. And he told me you were desperate to get him back, I'd replied. Said you were constantly texting him, begging for another chance. We'd looked at each other across the coffee shop table and started laughing. Not because it was funny, but because it was so perfectly, pathetically typical. Now, alone in my apartment, I thought about the woman I'd been before that night at the gallery. Sweet little Rachel who wouldn't understand art. Sweet little Rachel who should be grateful for whatever affection she received. Sweet little Rachel who made herself smaller to make others comfortable. That woman felt like a stranger to me now. My phone buzzed with a text from Maya. Saw the article in Forbes about your marketing firm. So proud of you. I smiled, setting the phone aside. The article had been about innovative approaches to social media marketing, featuring several successful campaigns I'd run for clients. The journalist had asked about my inspiration, and I'd told her the truth. Sometimes you have to be willing to show people who you really are, even if it makes them uncomfortable. Especially if it makes them uncomfortable. The sunset was painting my apartment walls gold, and I poured myself a glass of wine to celebrate the new contract. It was for a nonprofit organization that helped women leave abusive relationships, work that felt meaningful in a way that designing corporate logos never had. I thought about David sometimes, wondered if he understood what had really happened that night. It hadn't been about revenge, though it had felt satisfying. It had been about reclaiming my own narrative, refusing to be defined by someone else's limitations. He'd tried to make me believe I was too small for his world, when the truth was that his world was too small for who I was becoming. My laptop chimed with an email from a woman in Chicago who'd seen my story online. She was planning to leave her own manipulative relationship and wanted advice on how to document the emotional abuse she'd been experiencing. I opened a new document and began typing, sharing the lessons I'd learned about evidence, timing, and most importantly, trusting yourself when everyone else is trying to convince you you're wrong. Outside my window, the city hummed with life and possibility. I was part of that now, in a way I'd never been before. Not as someone's girlfriend, not as someone's disappointment, but as myself. Complicated, intelligent, occasionally vindictive, and absolutely done with apologizing for taking up space. The last line of my email to the woman in Chicago was something I'd learned to say to myself: you are not too much, you are not too little, you are exactly enough, and anyone who tries to convince you otherwise is telling you more about themselves than they are about you. I hit send and closed my laptop, raising my wine glass to toast the woman I'd become. Sweet little Rachel was gone forever, and I'd never been happier.